Today on Bonedry Retro, we'll be exploring the Centuri arcade game Time Pilot, released way back in 1982, at a time when space shooters were popular and players were seeking new experiences. Let's see if Time Pilot delivered. Before we get to Time Pilot, we have to take a look at some of the previous games which set the stage. One of the most popular being Galaga from Namco, released in 1981. This one had some unique elements based upon Galaxian, the 1979 title from the same company, enabling more movement from enemy ships, and one of the coolest features, of course, being able to double up your ship, which made for great challenging stages and some excellent gameplay dynamics. Wouldn't borrow much from Galaga, other than the popularity of the genre. And as we move forward, we will see other releases during this year, namely Defender from Williams, a once big name in pinball. They released this game to much popularity, mainly because of the ability to change position of your ship and go in different directions. Most side scrollers went in one direction only. The hyperspace button, along with the ability to save hostages, added some depth. Next would be Vanguard from SNK, also released in 1981. This enabled you to shoot in multiple directions by pointing the joystick that way. It had some other dynamics, namely an invincibility stage for a bit where you could just collide with enemies to defeat them. Again, graphics a bit on the limited side here in comparison to what would come in the future. These games were popular. There were several titles that had the space theme, and Time Pilot decided to take it in a different direction by adding an element of time travel. I remember clearly when this game arrived at my family's arcade back in 1982. It sat next to Q*bert, and next to that was Sega's Buck Rogers' Planet of Zoom. And for some reason, Time Pilot did not get much attention in the early going. I think mainly because on first look, it seems like a very simple game. It does borrow the element of saving, I wouldn't say hostages here, you're saving, parachuting comrades, so to speak, and it just looks basic until you get into the gameplay. The other unique thing about this game was the joystick. The joystick had more freedom of movement than any other joysticks before. You had an ability to sort of lift the joystick up and turn it over, and there were tricks that players would use and how they gripped it in order to get better control. The point system is also a little different here too. You have sort of squadrons of enemies. If you kill an entire squadron, you get bonus points. Same thing with rescuing the hostages. For each hostage, you get 1,000, but as long as you don't die, each continual one will go up higher and higher. So the third one will be 3,000, fourth one will be 4,000, unless you die. One thing that used to bother me is when you go to the next stage, as is about to happen right now, this doesn't carry over, so the hostages start at 1,000 again. It's a historically based game in that your first stage is in World War I. This stage here is World War II. As you see, the enemies have upgraded their technology along with the time. Also in the second stage, you have sort of bigger enemies that you can go after with higher points. That's left there. Squadrons exist as well. To get past each stage, you need to kill a certain amount of enemies, indicated on the bottom left. When that meter goes down, the major ship will show up, which you kill in order to make it to the next stage. The next stage here, of course, will be the next conflict, Vietnam, 1970, with helicopters as your enemies, with heat-seeking missiles. One of my favorite stages. The three stages of 1970, 1982, and 2001 are my favorites. Also, how intense they become. As you'll see now, there'll be a time warp into 1970, stage 3. One of my questions always centered around what are we fighting? Why are we going back from 1982 or 83 and fighting our people? It doesn't show a reason why that is. I didn't question it so much back then, but while playing it as an adult, I did. Notable for the time period are the graphics and animation, which are crisp, The sound also intense. The shots are much different than what you would hear from previous shooters, which didn't have similar sound chips. The hardware in this game obviously is upgraded. 82 was sort of a turning point in a lot of ways. This comes out in late 82, November, and it does take advantage of some advancements in technology at the time. You'll notice if you look at games from 1980 and 81 versus 82, the comparison between Defender and Time Pilot, which are merely a year apart, maybe a year and a half, is striking. The animations particularly are striking, as is the near 3D effect here with the clouds, something new for the time, where some of these ships will hide behind the clouds and go behind them, which is something that you didn't really see before, at least not at this level. And it made for an enjoyable experience. It's an extremely tough game in the later stages. The early stages, the first two, maybe three, are a bit easier. Once you get into 1970, stage 3, you need to be mindful of the missiles that are constantly fired at you, and one of the better strategies is to be in a constant circular, near figure 8 type of motion, which can help you avoid these. But you'll have to go back and forth, rotate left for a while, then rotate right to get ahead of those missiles and shoot them. Something that once mastered becomes a bit easy, but this is one of those games that falls under the label of difficult to start, in a sense, and even more difficult to master. Anybody can get past that first stage, but to get through the first round of stages, the first 5 stages, is difficult, and I remember people complaining about it. Arcade games, of course, at that time were centered around this idea of pumping quarters, and Time Pilot certainly fits that bill. To truly understand how advanced Time Pilot was hardware-wise, you need to take a look at what went on in the home console space. Here is a version of Time Pilot released for the Atari 2600 home console, and it's really nothing short of terrible. The graphics are basic, the sound even worse. It really looks nothing like the arcade, and it just goes to show that releasing home ports was difficult during this era. I think a lot of us know more about the Nintendo NES era, where the games looked really close. I remember Kung Fu Master, which was released on the NES as Kung Fu, retained the sound and nearly all the visuals. There were some palette changes and things like that. But here, you have a limited amount of colors available on the Atari 2600, a piece of hardware released in the late 70s. And, you know, we think of our console generations where you look at the 360 or the Xbox One versus the new Series X, and you can understand the advancements in graphic technology, but a game on the Xbox One looks good compared to an Xbox Series S or X, but not antiquated. And that's where we have a problem here. This looks antiquated next to what came out in the arcade, which helped arcade games maintain their popularity and also give them that wow factor that home consoles just couldn't repeat. Now, afterwards, we'll take a look at a couple of other versions, and we'll see some hardware that might be slightly more powerful, but still paling in comparison to what the arcade version could do, what an arcade board was capable of versus what a home board was capable of, particularly in graphics and sound. ColecoVision got lost in the home console world, mainly because of the arcade crash and home console crash of 1983, famously led by the Atari ET game, which I'm sure many of you have seen documentaries regarding. So a decent piece of hardware, as you can see. The graphics are a bit better. The clouds almost look the same as those from the arcade version. Of course, the planes have nowhere near the same amount of detail as they did. The screen's smaller too. Notice that. The shooting is similar. The movement is similar. You had a very strange controller on that ColecoVision unit. It looked like a phone pad with a knob at the top that was your joystick. But there is a significant bump in graphics compared to the Atari version. Interestingly, though, not anywhere near what the arcade version was. And again, it just shows the disparity between what was able to be done in the arcade with dedicated hardware versus a home console, which was created at a certain point in time and then stayed static for that amount of time. Sure, developers would learn to get more and more out of it, and game designers would tweak as best they can. But as you can see, there's just no way that you could say this really recreates the experience in the arcade. What we did back then is we liked the game, so we bought the home version to save money. But I want you to sort of think of it like fake sugar versus real sugar. One of the arguments about artificial sweeteners is they make you crave original sugar more. And in this sense, the artificial arcade port on a home console just whetted the appetite a little bit for the arcade version itself. What this could do, of course, the games didn't stay in the arcade very long. Time Pilot was a fairly popular game, but didn't have the staying power of a game like Pac-Man or Donkey Kong. So it was gone pretty quickly, and if you had to scratch the itch of Time Pilot, the only way to do it would be in the home. There was no emulation, obviously, in 1983, and we played this instead. It just gave us a longing for the game itself. I think playing these ports to the home consoles made me really develop a love for this game that carried on basically to today. It's one of my favorite games of all time, and I play it in all iterations possible. I've got it on Xbox Live Arcade. I have an emulation for it. I have an arcade stick that emulates it, and I have an actual Time Pilot little mini console. So it's just a great game. It's a lot of fun, a lot of action, and I highly recommend it.